I am Charles, an ordinary man with a stable job and always puts family first. In everyone's eyes, I am probably the ideal husband, calm, hardworking, and always trying to bring happiness to his wife, Michelle. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, waking me from my short nap. Today was a special day, Michelle and I's fifth wedding anniversary. I had everything ready the night before: a bouquet of red roses, her favorite bottle of wine, and a meticulously decorated small dining table in the living room. On the table, unlit candles waited for the perfect moment. Michelle had said she had to go on a business trip, but I didn't suspect a thing. I believed it was just a trick to surprise me. Michelle always knew how to make things special. I chuckled, imagining her walking into the house, pretending to be surprised by what I had prepared. While waiting, I decided to quickly check my phone. A morning routine like everyone else, but unexpectedly, this moment changed everything. I opened the social media app, scrolled through a few familiar posts from friends, and then a photo caught my eye. It was Michelle, her long hair flowing, the smile I once loved. But standing next to her was not me, but Joshua, her ex-lover. The two of them were standing on a mountaintop, under the gentle dawn light. Joshua's hand was around Michelle's waist, while their lips were intertwined. The caption under the photo made me even more breathless. The dream of 7 years ago has now come true. Time seemed to stop. I blinked, double-checking, hoping I was seeing things. But no. Every detail was painfully clear. The peaks were Colorado, the place we had promised to go on our honeymoon. Michelle had said she was too busy with work and told me to wait. And I waited. For 5 years, I waited. My heart was pounding like a hammer against my chest. I wanted to throw the phone away, but my hands were numb. All I could do was sit there, staring at the screen, as if staring any longer would make everything make sense. But no. It only made me realize that everything I'd believed in for the past 5 years was crumbling before my eyes. At that moment, I didn't cry or scream. I just felt cold, cold from deep within my heart. That freezing cold gradually spread throughout my body, making me unable to move. But then, I knew that I couldn't sit there forever. I stood up, picked up my phone, and texted my boss. I've accepted a transfer to Australia. I can start at the end of the month. The message was sent in seconds, but it felt like I had just put an end to a part of my life. I turned around and looked at the warm room I had decorated all evening. The candles were unlit, the wine unopened, and the flowers still smelled fragrant. But now all of them were just small details, in a tragedy I had never expected. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking around the space that had been prepared for a joyous celebration. But now, all I saw was emptiness. The unlit candles, the bouquet of red roses on the table, and the expensive bottle of wine that I'd spent the afternoon choosing, all of it was superfluous. At that moment, I didn't scream or break anything. Not because I wasn't in pain, but because the pain was so great that I didn't have the strength to express it. In my mind, memories of Michelle played back like a film reel. I remembered the first time I met her, the times I held her hand through hardships, and the times I gave up promotions to be with her. But now, the last image in my mind was her kissing Joshua at dawn. I picked up my phone and scrolled through some old photos of us together. Those smiles, those eyes, I thought they were meant for me. But now, they were just photographed lies. I took a deep breath, tried to calm myself, and pressed the call button for my boss. His voice came from the other end of the line, delighted. "Charles, have you thought it through? I'm glad you decided to take the position in Australia. It's a great opportunity, and I'm sure you'll be successful there." I smiled awkwardly, even though I knew he couldn't see it. "Yes, I'm ready. I can start by the end of the month." After the call ended, I put the phone down on the table, feeling both relieved and bitter. This decision was not just about work. It was the beginning of letting go. Letting go of Michelle. Letting go of the expectations and beliefs that had existed. I didn't know if it would be easy, but I knew that if I continued to stay, I would only hurt more. Michelle texted me at noon. Just a few short lines. "Sorry, I can't be home today. Work's been really busy. I'll be home late." I read the message with a bitter smile. It was obvious she didn't know that I had discovered her secret, but I didn't respond. I just put my phone aside and went back to my work. At night, the house became eerily quiet. There was no longer the familiar sound of Michelle's footsteps, no longer the sound of her laughter as she told stories from work. Instead, it was just me and the thoughts swirling in my head. I stepped out onto the balcony, looking at the city lights twinkling below. The wind blew hard, as cold as the feeling in my heart at that moment. I wondered, what did I do wrong to make things come to this? I loved Michelle with everything I had, but maybe that love wasn't enough. Or maybe I put my trust in the wrong person. In the early hours of the morning, I couldn't sleep. Exhausted, I took my phone back and opened social media again. The pictures of Michelle and Joshua were still there, a painful reminder of what had happened. But this time, instead of pain, I felt something else, a sense of relief. Maybe it was time for me to leave her life, just as she had left mine long ago. The next morning, I started packing, not because I wanted to leave right away, but because I wanted to prepare for a new beginning. I folded each shirt, carefully placed them in the suitcase as if each small action would help soothe the pain in my heart. I knew that when Michelle returned and saw me packing, she would ask why, but this time I wouldn't have to answer. I would let things end on their own, the way they were meant to. For me, that day was more than just our 5th wedding anniversary. It was also the day I realized that sometimes love isn't enough to keep two people together, and that some relationships aren't meant to be saved. They're meant to be let go. I first met Michelle on a chilly fall afternoon in our small town, where everyone knew each other. I was helping my father sort hay bales in the yard in preparation for winter. Laughter was heard from the yard next door. The neighborhood kids were playing tag. But I noticed that one little girl wasn't joining in. Michelle, thin and quiet, sat on the front steps, clutching an old book bag, staring at the ground as if trying to avoid eye contact. "That's Rebecca's girl," my mother said when she saw me looking. Rebecca, Michelle's mother, had left town when she was young, leaving Michelle to live with her grandmother. Her father was almost never around, busy with his job in another state and his new family. Michelle had grown up deprived in every way, both materially and emotionally. I didn't understand it all at the time. I just saw a sad little girl sitting alone, and it broke my heart. I walked up to her, holding my homemade model airplane. "Hey, do you want to try it?" I asked, hesitantly. Michelle looked up, her blue eyes sparkling in the autumn light. "Are you serious?" she asked, incredulous. I nodded, and for the first time I saw a smile cross her face, if only for a moment. From then on, we became friends. Michelle would often come over after school to help my mother bake or run errands. I began to feel a responsibility to make her happy, as if to fill a void in her life. Those long afternoons together became some of my most precious memories. Michelle, though quiet, had moments of warmth and humor that few people saw. As we entered our teenage years, that friendship turned into something deeper, at least on my part. Michelle remained distant, perhaps out of fear or because she was not used to being loved by someone. But whenever she needed me, I was always there, ready to listen and share. As time passed, we left our small town and entered the wider world. I went to college in Chicago, and Michelle accepted an art scholarship to New York. We kept in touch, but distance and busy lives gradually pulled us apart. One day, Michelle's texts stopped coming. Her calls stopped coming. I didn't know what happened. I just knew she was gone from my life. It wasn't until graduation day that I saw Michelle again. I was standing outside the auditorium, about to leave, when I heard her voice behind me. "Charles, long time no see." I turned around, and there stood Michelle in a simple red dress that stood out from the crowd. My heart sank when I saw her. She looked more mature, more confident, but her eyes still held a sadness that I recognized immediately. We walked around campus that night, talking about everything but why she had disappeared. When I asked, she just shook her head. "There are things I don't want to remember," she said, her eyes on the distant streetlights. I didn't press further. I had lost Michelle once, and I didn't want to do anything to make her leave me again. Before I knew it, Michelle leaned in and kissed me. It was the first time we crossed the line from friends to something more. I can't describe the feeling, sudden, intense, and most of all, certain that I would never lose her again. We started a relationship the next night. Love with Michelle was like coming home, familiar yet new, comforting yet challenging. For me, Michelle was not only the person I loved, but also the center of my life. But I didn't know that, even then, there were small cracks between us that I was too blind to see. When Michelle and I got married, it was a warm spring day in the Boston suburbs where we decided to start our new life together. Michelle wore a pure white wedding dress and carried a bouquet of white tulips, her favorite flower. As I watched her walk down the aisle, I vowed that I would do anything to make her happy. The first years of our marriage seemed promising. We moved into a small but cozy apartment in the city center. Michelle started working at a large advertising agency where she quickly rose through the ranks thanks to her creativity and hard work. I also had a stable job in finance, but gradually I realized that Michelle was the real star of the family. She was busy with work and personal projects, while I took care of the little things like cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the house. At first, I was fine with that. I loved Michelle and was willing to do anything to help her focus on her career. But the balance of our relationship gradually changed in ways I didn't expect. Michelle started spending more time at the office or traveling for work, often missing the evenings we used to plan together. When I asked, she always said she was too busy with work, and I believed her. I always believed her. Then one day, my boss called me into his office and offered me an opportunity that many people can only dream of. The company was opening a branch in San Francisco and needed a CFO to lead the team there. It was not only a promotion, but also a huge jump in salary and professional prestige. But when I told Michelle about the offer, she was not enthusiastic. San Francisco? That means we'll have to move, she said, setting her coffee down on the table. I'm not sure this is a good time. I'm very busy with work, and moving to a new city would be too disruptive. I thought a lot about it in the days that followed. This opportunity could change my life, but I didn't want to do anything that would pressure or inconvenience Michelle. In the end, I turned down the offer and stayed in Boston. I convinced myself that it was the right decision, but inside I began to feel a bitterness that I didn't dare admit. My sacrifices didn't stop there. Michelle didn't like cooking. She used to say it reminded her of the hard times she'd had living with her grandmother, so I learned to cook. I took a weekend cooking class just so I could make the dishes she loved. I told myself this was a way to make her feel loved, but every time she finished dinner without even looking at me, I felt a sense of loss. My second birthday was one of the first times I realized the distance between us. I'd made reservations at a restaurant Michelle had said I wanted to try, hoping for a romantic evening, but she was late, saying she had an important advertising campaign to finish. Sorry, Charles. I forgot it was your birthday, she said, kissing me quickly on the cheek before rushing into the bathroom to wash off her makeup. I tried to smile and say, it's okay. But as I looked at the empty dining table with the nearly burned out candle, I couldn't help but feel like an extra in her life. One of the biggest blows came in our third year of marriage. We had planned a trip to Colorado, where we both wanted to see the sunrise over the mountains. It was a dream we'd talked about since our first date. But at the last minute, Michelle said she was too busy with work and told me to go alone if I wanted to. I didn't go. I thought that if she was less busy, we could do it together. But that dream never came true, at least not for me. As time went on, I felt Michelle slipping away from me. She no longer looked at me with the same gentleness as before, and our conversations became shorter and more superficial. But every time I tried to express my feelings, she had a way of soothing me. A quick kiss, a sweet word like, "You mean everything to me, Charles. I don't know what I would do without you." Those words were like a sedative, making me temporarily forget the anxiety in my heart. I remember one time I came across an old social media post from Joshua about the time he and Michelle used to be together. In the post, he said that Michelle cooked for him every day, just because he didn't like the cafeteria food. This stabbed my self-esteem, but I didn't say anything to Michelle. Instead, I continued to do everything to make her feel loved, hoping that somehow I could win her back. But deep down, I began to realize that my efforts were like a small boat trying to stay afloat in a big storm. Michelle was no longer mine, even though I wasn't ready to admit it. And then, the cracks in our marriage grew larger and larger, waiting for the final collision to break it all. Michelle had always been a private person. She never talked much about her work or her relationships, and I respected that. But gradually, her silence began to bother me. It started with little things: the unusual late night calls, the nights she came home later than usual, the way she kept her phone by her side, never letting it out of her sight. I tried to push the negative thoughts away, telling myself that I was imagining things. But one particular event sparked my suspicions. It was Friday, and I had come home earlier than usual after a meeting had been abruptly canceled. Michelle had told me that morning that she would be working late at the office, but as I walked into the house, I noticed something was wrong. Her coat wasn't hanging on the hanger as usual, but her usual pair of high heels were neatly placed by the door. The living room was quiet, but I could hear whispering coming from the bedroom. I walked slowly towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I recognized Michelle's voice, but she spoke very softly. "Yeah, I know. We have to be more careful. Okay, let me arrange it." I couldn't hear everything, but every word she said was like a small knife stabbing at my heart. I pushed the door open and entered, and Michelle turned around in surprise, the phone in her hand immediately turned off. "Charles? Why are you back so early?" She smiled awkwardly, but her eyes were clearly averted. I looked at her, trying to keep calm. "I thought you were working in the office." Um, I... I went home to get something," she said quickly, putting the phone down on the table as if to hide it from me. "Nothing important." I didn't press her for further explanation, but the uneasiness in my heart grew. I didn't want to be the type of person who was unreasonably jealous, but it was clear that Michelle was hiding something from me. That night, I couldn't sleep. In the dark, I lay quietly next to her, listening to her steady breathing, while my mind was spinning with unanswered questions. After that night, I tried to push my doubts aside and go about my life as usual. But Michelle's silence whenever I asked about work, or the way she kept her phone with her at all times, made me feel uneasy. I wondered if I was being an overly jealous husband. I convinced myself that Michelle loved me and would never do anything to hurt me, but part of me still couldn't be at peace. A week later, the truth began to emerge. That day, Michelle said she had a company party and would be home late. I believed her as usual, but that night, a sudden downpour began. Worried that she might have trouble getting home, I called Michelle to check in. The phone rang, but no one answered. I called a second time, then a third time. Still no answer. I was filled with worry, and I immediately decided to call one of her colleagues, someone I had met at a company event. "Excuse me, is your company having a party today?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. The other end of the line hesitated before answering. "Party? No, nothing today. We got off work this afternoon." I felt like someone had punched me in the chest. I turned off my phone and sat in the car for a long time, letting the rain outside blur my vision. Michelle had lied to me. She wasn't at the company party. Where was she? And why would she hide it from me? I wasn't one to stalk my wife, but that night, I couldn't sit still. I drove around the city, looking for any trace of Michelle, but to no avail. It was almost midnight when I returned home. The apartment was eerily quiet. Michelle still hadn't come home. At that moment, I didn't know what to do but check my social media, which I rarely used. And then, as if fate was teasing me, I saw a post from Joshua, Michelle's ex. In the photo, Michelle was sitting next to him, at a table in a restaurant I didn't recognize. They were smiling brightly together, their glasses of wine glinting in the light. The caption below the photo was a direct taunt to me. "It's always a pleasure to share special moments with the people who know you best." I felt my body freeze, not because of the photo, but because of the truth it revealed. Michelle hadn't just lied to me, she had chosen to spend the evening with Joshua over me. She had chosen the man from her past over the man she was trying to build a future with. Michelle came home around 1 in the morning, her heels clicking on the wooden floor as she walked in. I sat on the sofa, my eyes never leaving her. She looked at me, paused for a moment, then smiled tiredly. "Why are you still up? It's so late." "Where have you been?" I asked, my voice so calm I didn't recognize it as mine. Michelle paused, her eyes averted as she shrugged off her jacket. "I told you the company party went on too long. I'm exhausted. Can we talk tomorrow morning?" I wanted to believe her, but the image of the photo was so clear in my mind. Instead of answering, I just stood up and walked into the bedroom. leaving Michelle standing silently in the living room. That night, we slept in two different worlds, me tossing and turning with pain and disappointment, and her drifting off to sleep as if nothing had happened. After that night, my relationship with Michelle went into a cold tailspin. I started noticing more and more the little details that I'd previously overlooked. Michelle stopped smiling when I told her interesting things about work. My questions often got vague answers, and whenever I tried to have a serious conversation, she would avoid or change the subject. One Saturday morning, I overheard Michelle talking on the phone in her office. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but her voice, tinged with nervousness and sweetness, kept me from leaving. Joshua, I don't know. I just want things to go back to the way they were. I stood rooted to the door, feeling like a stranger in my own home. That night, while we were having dinner, I decided to confront her. Michelle, I want to ask you something, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. She looked up, her blue eyes seemingly lacking the warmth they once had. What? Joshua, are you still in contact with him? I looked her straight in the eyes, waiting for a reaction that I hoped would come true. Michelle set her fork down on the table, her lips pursed as if considering. Do you really want to go this route, Charles? She asked, her voice more defiant than apologetic. We don't need to make a big deal out of this. Joshua is just an old friend. He needs my help with something, and I think you'll understand. Understand? How could I understand when the woman I loved was giving my attention to someone else? Anger flared inside me, but I didn't shout. I just looked at her, feeling disappointed. Old friend? I repeated, almost laughing. Old friend you never mentioned. Old friend you hid from me to meet late at night? Michelle stood up, her eyes sharp. Charles, you're making a big deal out of this. You know I'm busy with work. Joshua is just a small part of my life, and I don't want to have to explain things to you every time you have doubts. Her tone, defensive, only made me feel more distant. We didn't speak again that night. She slept in her study, and I lay in bed, feeling like the world was falling apart around me. I realized that I wasn't losing Michelle. She had been gone for a long time, and I had just refused to accept the truth. A week later, as I was trying to focus on work, my boss called me into his office. Charles, the CFO position in San Francisco is still open, he said, his eyes full of anticipation. I don't want to push you, but I believe this is the greatest opportunity for your career. I had turned down that offer before, because of Michelle. But now I wasn't sure I had a reason to stay. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made for her, opportunities, time, trust, and I realized that I couldn't continue to live my life around Michelle. I needed a fresh start, one that wasn't held captive by unmet expectations. I agree, I said, my voice calm but firm. My boss smiled and patted me on the shoulder. I know you won't let me down. That evening, I started packing. When Michelle came home, she found me packing my suitcase on the bed. Where are you going? She asked, surprised. San Francisco, I answered without looking at her. I took the job I should have taken a long time ago. Michelle stood there, saying nothing. For the first time in a long time, I didn't wait for her approval or excuses. I just knew that I was ready to change. Not for her, but for myself. I never thought our relationship would get to this point. Silent, distant, and filled with suspicion. But when I realized that all my efforts to hold on to Michelle were futile, I decided to put things on the table. One night, over an awkward dinner, I looked her straight in the eye and said what I had been considering all week. Michelle, we need to talk, I began, my voice calm but firm. She looked up from her salad plate, a look of confusion in her eyes. What is it, Charles? I took a deep breath. I don't want to go on like this, feeling like an outsider in my own marriage. I put my fork down on the table, my eyes never leaving hers. If you really want to save things, I'll ask one thing. For a week, you don't contact or see Joshua. If you do, I'll forget about it all and we can start over. Michelle froze, her expression frozen for a moment. She set her glass down on the table, her eyes pensive. A week? She repeated, her voice tinged with disbelief. Charles, is this what you think will fix things? Yes, I said firmly. A week. Just a week. If you can't, then we have nothing more to say. Michelle looked at me, hesitation written all over her face, but finally she nodded. a thin smile on her lips. Okay, Charles. If it makes you feel better, I'll do it. I promise. In the early days, Michelle tried to act like she was keeping her promise. She would come home earlier than usual, taking the time to cook, something she rarely did since we got married. One night, she made my favorite roast beef, something I hadn't seen on the table in years. I remember you like this, she said, her eyes shining as if she were trying to make me feel good, but I couldn't help but think that this was all part of the act she was putting on. Michelle also started doing things she had always refused to do. She agreed to take a walk with me around the park, something I had suggested countless times but always got turned down saying she was too busy. She also suggested that we watch old movies that we had both loved when we first started dating. I tried to enjoy the moment, but the doubt in my heart wouldn't go away. Was this the real Michelle? Or was it just an attempt to appease me while her mind was still on Joshua? By the fourth day, Michelle canceled a date with friends to stay home with me. She even brought home a bouquet of white tulips, the flowers she had once said she didn't care for because flowers are just frivolous. I looked at the bouquet on the table, and I felt like I was watching a perfect performance. Michelle was doing everything she could to prove that she was worthy of forgiveness. But every time she smiled, every time she said sweet words, I couldn't help but wonder if they were truly from her heart. As the weekend drew closer, Michelle seemed more determined. But instead of feeling relieved, I felt pressure building. A small voice inside me kept repeating, "She won't change. This is just a game to keep him around." And then, on the final day of the challenge, what I feared most happened. On the final day of the challenge, I tried to stay calm, even as I felt the tension creeping in every minute. Michelle had been perfect all week. She seemed like the wife I had always wanted, gentle, caring, and devoted to me. But instead of happiness, I felt empty. I had loved Michelle with all my heart, but now I wasn't sure I could trust anything she said or did. That evening, Michelle suggested dinner at the restaurant where we had our first date. I agreed, although I was a little skeptical. We arrived at the restaurant and sat at our usual table under soft yellow lights. Michelle was wearing a simple blue dress, her hair loosely falling over her shoulders, and the smile on her face reminded me of the early days of our relationship. "Remember, we used to laugh nonstop because you were struggling with a steak knife," she said, her eyes sparkling as if trying to recall the good memories between us. I smiled slightly, but inside I didn't feel really comfortable. We ordered, talked about small things, but neither of us mentioned the cracks in our marriage. Dinner was almost perfect, until Michelle's phone rang. She looked at the screen, a look of confusion in her eyes before quickly hanging up. "It's just a work call," she said, trying to lighten the mood. I didn't respond, just stared at her in silence. But a few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, Michelle peeked at the screen, then set it face down on the table. The confusion in her eyes said it all. "Is it Joshua?" I asked, my voice low but clear. Michelle fell silent, her hands tightening around the glass in front of her. "No, just a colleague," she replied, but her tone had lost its usual confidence. I didn't ask any more questions, just stood up. "I need to go to the bathroom." As I turned back from the bathroom, I heard Michelle's voice, quiet but clear enough to make my heart freeze. "Joshua, you can't keep calling me like that. Okay, I'll see you after dinner, but this is the last time, okay?" I walked over to the table, and Michelle looked up when she saw me. Panic flashed across her face, but she managed a forced smile. "You're back?" she said, putting the phone back on the table as if nothing had happened. I sat down, looking at her, feeling like I was facing a stranger. "You're right, Michelle. This will be the last time," I said, my voice so cold I didn't even recognize it. She was silent, her eyes wavering between confusion and fear. "What do you mean?" I didn't answer right away. I called the waiter, asked for the check, and looked at Michelle one last time. "I'm not going to stay in a relationship where I'm the only one making an effort. I'm leaving tomorrow. You take care of the rest of yourself." Michelle tried to say something, but the words caught in her throat. I stood up and left the restaurant without looking back. That night, I packed up the rest of my things in my apartment. I didn't feel angry or hurt anymore, just relieved that I had finally made the right decision. The next morning, I left Boston to start a new chapter in my life, leaving behind everything that no longer belonged to me. Life in San Francisco started slowly but more gently than I expected. I rented a small apartment near the harbor where I could see the Golden Gate Bridge from the balcony every morning. In the early days, I spent most of my time getting used to my new job and exploring the city, a way to fill the void inside. My boss was right. The CFO position was not just a career opportunity, but a gateway to a new life. I threw myself into the job with all the focus I'd once devoted to Michelle. My colleagues welcomed me warmly, and I began to build new relationships that weren't clouded by the shadow of the past. One of the first things I noticed after leaving Boston was the sense of freedom I felt. No more trying to please Michelle, no more guessing what she was thinking or doing. In the mornings, I would wake up early to jog along the beach, feeling the salty breeze and the first rays of sunlight. In the evenings, I would read books or watch movies that Michelle had previously ignored. For the first time in years, I began to live for myself. Sometimes I think about Michelle, not with resentment, but with a vague sense of regret. I miss what we had, or maybe just what I thought we had, but I quickly push those thoughts out of my mind. Life in San Francisco is too busy and exciting to dwell on the past. One evening after work, I received a text message from an old friend in Boston. "Charles, have you heard? Michelle just got back together with Joshua. Things don't seem to be going well." The text made me pause for a moment, but I didn't reply. I didn't want to know anything more about Michelle's life. She was no longer a part of my life, and that was okay. Life went on. I took cooking classes, something I never thought I would do. I joined running clubs and made friends with people who shared my interests. With each step, I found myself again, a version of me that Michelle never knew. A year after leaving Boston, I was fully settled in San Francisco. I had just been promoted to branch manager, and my team was achieving success I never thought I could help create. Every day, I felt like I was moving forward, letting go of what had held me back. One weekend afternoon, as I sat in my usual coffee shop reading, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an old friend in Boston. "Charles, there's something I think you should know." Attached to the text was a photo of Michelle and Joshua, but this time there were no smiles or romantic moments. Michelle looked haggard, and Joshua looked down, pale and tired. Soon after, my friend called. "I don't mean to bother you, but this is really strange. After you left, Michelle and Joshua went public with their relationship, but just a few months later, they started arguing and broke up. Yesterday, I heard that Joshua had injured himself because he was obsessed with Michelle. She was so out of control that she had to be hospitalized for psychiatric treatment." I was silent, not knowing how to respond. Part of me felt sorry for Michelle, but a larger part of me, the part I had been building for the past year, just felt relief. The tragedies Michelle and Joshua were going through were no longer my business. I was out of their loop, and that made me feel at peace. A few weeks later, I got an email from Michelle. I don't know how she found my address, but it was short. "Charles, I was wrong. If possible, I'd like to meet you to explain. I'm in San Francisco. Please, just this once." I read the email 3 times, then put the phone down. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure I wanted to confront Michelle, not because I still held any resentment toward her, but because I didn't want to be dragged back into the past. But in the end, I decided to agree. Part of me wanted to hear what she had to say, not to forgive, but to completely close the chapter in my life. We met at a small cafe near the docks. Michelle had changed a lot. She was thinner, her eyes were sunken, and her face looked tired. "Charles," she began, her voice hoarse and weaker than I remembered. "I don't know where to start, but I want to apologize. I hurt you, and I can't forgive myself for that." I stayed silent, listening to her tell me what happened after I left. Joshua turned out to be not who she thought he was: controlling, jealous, and slowly pushing Michelle into a crisis. "I thought I had found true love," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "But it turns out I was just running away from myself." When she stopped, I just smiled slightly. "Michelle, I don't hate you, but I don't love you anymore either. We've had a long road together, and I think it's right where it needs to stop." Michelle nodded, tears falling down her cheeks. "I understand. I just want you to know that I'm sorry, and I hope you can find happiness." I stood up, leaving the coffee money on the table. "I have found happiness," I said. and left without looking back. As I stepped outside, I felt the warm sunlight on my face. For the first time, I felt a real sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted. Michelle had been wrong, and I had been hurt. But in the end, I had come through it, stronger, freer, and ready for the better things that lay ahead. Because life doesn't wait for anyone, and I'm not standing still waiting for anyone anymore. I move forward towards the future that I build for myself.